Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of 10-Minute Theology. We've been going through and actually just finished up a series on the judgment seat of Christ, transitioning this week, talking about angels, as I promised to you last week. Interesting subject. We'll have a whole lot of episodes on this. Quite an in-depth subject, and we'll take a look at it here as we start to march through. So as we look at the topic of angels and start to think about it, we're going to break this up into three main sections, okay? So as we look at the sections as well, okay, each section will be divided into individual parts also. So obviously start with an introduction overall on angels. Section 2 will start to talk about what the Bible has to say about good angels. Clearly, we hope that the majority of angels out there are good. We'll talk about the numbers of angels as well. So it's kind of interesting, too, that the Bible does mention something about, gives us an idea on the numbers of angels. Section 3, then we'll transition. We start to talk about what the Bible has to say about the quote-unquote bad angels, the fallen angels. What about demons? Are fallen angels and demons the same thing? Are they different? Are there nuances between them? We'll talk about that. And also we'll investigate what are the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 5. If you've never heard about that, go take a look at that. Gets pretty interesting when we get there, and that can help us differentiate as well between fallen angels and demons. There's some nuances there. We'll save that till we get to them, but in the meantime, let's go ahead and get started with our study. So section 1, introduction to angels. So interesting, right? Good thing to remember. We live in a multi-dimensional world, okay? And we can't see it all. And I know with our Western way of thought, right? We're very scientific. We think we're very educated, and we don't really think about anything that we can't see, touch, feel, hear, taste, whatever it may be, okay? But we know from the Bible that the spirit world is very real, and there's this whole world that's out there that we don't have visibility into. And the fact that we don't have visibility into it causes people angst and discern at times, okay? Regardless of that, it's some interesting things to think about as we start to look at it. And I'd like to read you a story here, and it's pretty interesting. I tell you, if you ever get a chance to go pick up Billy Graham's book on angels, as I figure out how to get my screen switched here. Here we go. Billy Graham's book on angels. Great introduction to the topic. It's aged a little bit just in terms of when it was produced, but of course God's word has not changed. So I wanted to read you just an excerpt from it because he has some really fascinating stories at the beginning of the book. So let me go ahead and read one of these to you. A story from a missionary. His name was John G. Paton. So the Reverend John G. Paton, pioneer missionary to the New Hebrides Islands, told a thrilling story involving the proactive care of angels. Hostile natives surrounded his mission headquarters one night, intent on burning the patrons out and killing them. John Paton and his wife prayed all during the terror-filled night that God would deliver them. When daylight came, they were amazed to see that, unaccountably, the attackers had left. They thanked God for delivering them. A year later, the chief of the tribe was converted to Jesus Christ, and Mr. Paton, remembering what had happened, asked the chief what had kept him and his men from burning down the house and killing them. The chief replied in surprise, "Who were all of those men that you had with you there?" The missionary answered, "There were no men there, just my wife and I." The chief argued that they had seen many men standing guard, hundreds of big men in shining garments with drawn swords in their hands. They seemed to circle the mission station so that the natives were afraid to attack. Only then did Mr. Paton realize that God had sent his angels to protect them. The chief agreed there could be no other explanation. Could it be that God had sent a legion of angels to protect his servants whose lives were being endangered? Okay, so again, just a quick story from the introduction in Billy Graham's Angels. Again, I really recommend if you're fascinated by the subject and interested in it. It's a very approachable book, very readable book, very short book. It gives a fantastic introduction to the subject. One more thing I wanted to show you too, because it's interesting, right? And we think about living in the multidimensional world. What better thing, what better group of people to help us envision this multidimensional world than mathematicians, which makes it very challenging, right? But how about artists as well? Artists' interpretation of what's going on out there. And believe it or not, Salvador Dali had a painting, and it's called The Crucifixion, also Corpus Hypercubus by Salvador Dali, done in 1954. And you see this picture here, and it appears Christ to be on a cross, right? But it's a very unusual cross. So if you look back at the name Corpus Hypercubus, hypercube is actually a multidimensional representation of a cube. So if you think about a square, we can draw a square on a piece of paper very simply. Of course, most of us also, and we learned even in grade school, how to draw a two-dimensional representation of a cube on paper too, that makes it look like there's a 3D cube on our paper. If you want to start getting into a different dimension, a fourth dimensional cube then is what you're looking at right here. So that would be a two-dimensional representation of a four-dimensional cube. And you say, well, why the heck would Salvador Dali do that within this painting? He was trying to indicate to people that there was something far deeper going on at the crucifixion than what people were able to see. And by putting Christ on a four-dimensional cube that we can't comprehend really in our mind and can't visualize that well either, he was making that statement that there's this whole unseen world out there that we're each grappling with and trying to figure out what it is. So interesting painting done by Salvador Dali himself. Okay, but let's keep marching on here now as we talk about our introduction to angels. What does society say about angels, right? I mean, as you think about what does the typical person when you bring up angels think? They usually think a winged creature. There's lots of statue representations of angels. If you go to any art gallery, art museum, you'll find statue after statue. Any big church, the ornate churches in England, the ornate churches in the U.S., as well. St. Paul's Cathedral in London is fascinating, but there's statue after statue of angels in there. Marble carvings of them, different medium used to represent these angels, right? But it's just it's a creature and a figure that has fascinated mankind for quite some time. And that's why we duplicate it with our mini statues, our paintings, our pictures that we hang on our walls, all of that, right? But I think if we were to think the most, what influences people's, and notice I put in quotes, knowledge of angels today outside of the Bible, right? So the typical non-believer, when you ask them about angels, for the most part, they're going to say, hey, and they're going to quote you some movie, and their knowledge of angels is going to be framed in the context of some movie that they've seen or multiple movies that they've seen. So maybe they're not looking into what the Bible says about angels, but what movies have to say about them. So I wanted to put a few up here because it's kind of interesting. And it's actually kind of a fun exercise too when you think about it, because they're out there. But as we look at different movies that angels appear in, especially as we approach the Christmas season, it's now middle November in 2024 as I'm recording this. A lot of people love It's a Wonderful Life. Okay, and of course, there's an angel in there, and fascinating, the angel's name within A Wonderful Life, his name, a very biblical name, Clarence was his name, but if you've seen the movie, you know the story, so we won't dwell on that, but let's look at another one. City of Angels is a movie that came out in the early 2000s. Nicolas Cage and Melanie Griffith were in it. Fascinating movie, and I'm not saying it was a biblical movie at all. Clearly, if you would watch the movie, you would understand why. But there was interesting parts of it. In fact, it opens with a scene with a little girl who, I don't remember if she dies in a car accident or from some other instance, but she's in an emergency room, and Nicolas Cage is there. He is the angel, and at least one of them in the movie. And she, sits up in her bed and starts to walk away with him, and turns around and looks, and her mom's crying hysterically because she's dead, on the gurney, and she looks at him and says, Mommy's not going to understand. And he looked at her and said something like, she will someday. So there was some interesting quotes in it. And regardless, again, not saying it's a biblical based movie, far from it. But still, it's interesting as you get into it. Now, some other ones interesting here. Of course, Denzel Washington, Whitney Houston. Denzel was the angel. The Preacher's Wife came out, I believe, in the 1990s. I forget the exact date on it, but anyway, Denzel Washington was the angel. Had another very biblical Hebrew name of Dudley. So interesting, the names that they give the angels in the movies. Most people may or may not know that actually The Preacher's Wife, which was done in the 90s, was a remake of a movie called The Bishop's Wife, which is done in 47, I believe, is in the late 40s. And what other better person at the time to make that same angel than Cary Grant? His name was also Dudley in that. The characters' names were the same in that. It's a moderate mirror copy of each other, but both of them are really well done. Again, not saying that they're biblically based movies in terms of what the angels are doing, but there's some biblical truth there, which is pretty interesting. Of course, Disney had to get into it, right? Angels in the Outfield. And of course, the TV shows, they got to get into it as well. So we had Michael Landon, Victor French, I believe, is the other actor's name. And of course, this is not Little House on the Prairie, but it was Highway to Heaven, and a popular series as well. And of course, Touched by an Angel was a very popular series as well. So interesting shows. We won't dwell on them any longer, but yet it's interesting to see. And if you talk to people, you'll hear references a lot of times that they'll go back to movies on their knowledge of angels. So something to keep in mind as you're interacting with the people and talking with them. But what about biblical stories of angels? Interesting things out there. So, one of the first encounters we come with an angel, of course, is in the garden. And in Genesis chapter 3, of course, we read about the serpent. But when they were kicked out of the garden, okay, remember that there was the angel that was blocking the entrance back to the Garden of Eden? So we read actually that it was a cherubim, and there was a flaming sword there, so preventing them from getting back into the garden. So angels are right up front. And also, as we progress through our study, we'll see that the angels were actually there during creation, when God created the world. So there is allusions to that within the book of Job, but we'll see those a later time. Stories of Elijah and his servant, fascinating story, a brief little thing, go read it in 2 Kings chapter 6. Basically, his servant is panicking, right, because there's a bunch of people around him, and Elisha prays to God to open his eyes so that he can see what's there. And God opens his eyes, and he sees chariots all around them, protecting them, right? And so God has sent his heavenly host of angels to protect those two. Of course, the birth of Christ is as we approach the Christmas time, most people know the story. So hopefully most will be able to relate to that. Oh, you're starting to get to a society now that is very unchurched and may or may not have any recollection of the story whatsoever. But the birth of Christ, of course, we have the announcement to Mary and to Joseph at the beginning. Clearly, she becomes pregnant. And it's funny as you look at this, right? I mean, it shows you the wisdom of God, because he sends an angel to Joseph as well. Why? Because Joseph probably is not going to buy the story, right? If something supernatural event doesn't happen to him, so that he's being told also. But anyway, interesting there. And of course, the announcement to the shepherds after the birth of Christ. So amazing stories as you start to read those and think about what people were experiencing and what they were seeing. Just phenomenal it would have been to witness that stuff. We read that, you can check it out, Matthew 4, chapter 4. Angels attended Jesus after the temptation. So the temptation of Christ in Matthew chapter 4, out in the wilderness. Of course, multiple angels here, because we have Satan who shows up to tempt him. He's the tempter. But after this is all done, we see that the angels come and attend to Jesus for his physical need, for going without food for so long. We see more angels at the tomb after the resurrection as well. So tremendous story there, and fascinating. The angels are on the scene as well. Of course, we encounter several encounters with angels. I mean, they're going to prison. They're opening prison doors and allowing people to escape. Several encounters throughout the book of Acts. So just amazing as the phenomenal supernatural things that are occurring within the book of Acts, especially the first half of it, that angels are there as well and making an appearance in the stories, which is just phenomenal. And of course, you get to the book of Revelation. So the last book of the New Testament probably has the most references of angels of any book in the New Testament, and probably within the entire Bible. Just amazing, horrific things occur as we see in the book of Revelation. But a tremendous amount of references to angels within that book also. Okay, so that will bring us to an end of our first episode and our introduction to angels. Next time, we'll be back to introduction part 2. We'll start to dig into the text more and get more details on angels, who they are, what they do, very in a generalized way. What about the names of angels? What names of angels do we have? How many angels are out there? Things like that we'll look at. So come along with us for the study. Hope you have a great week. God bless you. Take care, and go out and serve Jesus Christ this week. Take care, everybody. Bye now.